The spring air filled Washington Park with a sense of renewal. Children played on the swings while joggers followed the winding paths between blooming cherry trees. Among them was Thomas Johnson, a 42-year-old man who had come to enjoy his lunch break in peace. Thomas sat on a bench, unwrapping his sandwich while watching ducks glide across the small pond. At 6, with broad shoulders and dark skin, he had an imposing presence that belied his gentle nature. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants, and a navy blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He kept to himself, occasionally checking his phone. Officer Richard Miller patrolled the park that afternoon as part of his regular beat. At 38, he'd been with the police department for nearly 15 years, developing habits and assumptions that colored his view of the world. His thinning hair and perpetual frown made him look older than his years. As he scanned the park, his eyes locked onto Thomas. Something about Thomas bothered Officer Miller. Perhaps it was how Thomas kept looking at his watch, or how he seemed to be watching the children play. Whatever the reason, Miller's suspicion grew with each passing minute. He had dealt with troublemakers in the park, before drug dealers using the family-friendly environment as cover for their activities. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Miller said as he approached Thomas. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Thomas looked up, surprised. "Just having lunch," he replied calmly, gesturing to his half-eaten sandwich. "My office is just down the street." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed. "I've been watching you. You seem pretty interested in those kids over there." Thomas followed, Miller's gaze toward the playground. "I wasn't watching the children," he explained. "I was just enjoying being outside. It's a beautiful day. Can I see some ID?" Miller asked, his hand resting casually near his holster. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, that same sensation he'd experienced countless times before when unfairly singled out. He considered explaining that he was actually watching the ducks, not the children. He thought about mentioning that he was a father himself, but experience had taught him to stay calm and compliant. "I don't understand why you need my ID. I'm just sitting here eating lunch," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Miller insisted, his tone hardening. "It's just a routine check." People nearby began to notice the interaction. A young woman walking her dog slowed her pace, watching with concern. An elderly couple on a nearby bench whispered to each other. Thomas felt their eyes on him. He felt the situation slipping beyond his control. "I have the right to be here," Thomas said, his lunch forgotten. "I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Miller stepped closer. "Are you refusing to comply, sir?" Thomas knew he had a choice to make. He could continue to resist what he knew was an unjust demand, or he could comply to avoid escalation. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his driver's license. "But I want you to know, I don't appreciate being harassed while I'm just trying to eat my lunch." Officer Miller examined the ID, his expression unchanged. "Wait here," he said, walking a few steps away to radio in the information. As he waited, Thomas noticed more people watching. A man had taken out his phone and appeared to be recording the interaction. Thomas felt humiliation wash over him, but also a spark of hope that at least there would be a record of this incident. Miller returned, his demeanor slightly different. "Where did you say you work, Mr. Johnson?" "I didn't," Thomas replied, "but I work at Franklin Medical Center. I'm the head of cardiology there." A flicker of surprise crossed Miller's face, but he quickly composed himself. "A doctor, huh? What's a doctor doing hanging around a park in the middle of a workday?" Thomas took a deep breath. "As I told you, I'm on my lunch break. The hospital is 2 blocks away. I come here often when the weather is nice." Near the playground, a woman had been watching the interaction while her daughter played on the swings. She approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, looking between Thomas and Officer Miller. "Everything's fine, ma'am," Miller replied curtly. "Just conducting routine police business." "He hasn't done anything," the woman said. "He sits on that same bench almost every day. Sometimes we chat about his kids and mine." Thomas recognized her as Rachel, a regular at the park whose daughter attended the same school as his son. He nodded gratefully at her. Officer Miller seemed momentarily thrown off balance. He handed the ID back to Thomas but didn't apologize. "Just doing my job," he said. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." "What kind of suspicious activity involves eating a sandwich?" Rachel asked, not backing down. Other onlookers had gathered now. The man with the phone was still recording. Officer Miller's radio crackled, and he stepped away to answer it, turning his back to the growing crowd. Thomas remained seated, his appetite gone. The sandwich sat forgotten beside him. He'd experienced this kind of treatment before, but that didn't make it any easier. Each time felt like the same shock, the same anger, the same careful control he needed to maintain. When Miller returned, his face had lost some of its sternness. "You're free to go, Doctor Johnson," he said, emphasizing the title in a way that sounded almost sarcastic. "Enjoy your lunch." As Miller walked away, Rachel sat down beside Thomas. "Are you okay?" she asked. Thomas nodded, though they both knew it wasn't true. "This isn't the first time," he said quietly, "and it probably won't be the last." What neither Thomas nor Officer Miller realized was that the incident had already begun spreading beyond the park. The man recording had uploaded the video to social media, where it was quickly gaining attention. And Thomas Johnson wasn't just any doctor, he was one of the most respected cardiologists in the state, a man who had saved countless lives, including the life of the police commissioner's wife just 6 months earlier. The story was just beginning to unfold. By evening, the video of Thomas's encounter with Officer Miller had been viewed over 50 times. Hashtags demanding justice spread across social media platforms. Local news stations began reaching out to both the police department and Franklin Medical Center for comments. Thomas returned to work that afternoon, trying to focus on his patients despite the churning in his stomach. He hadn't told anyone at the hospital about the incident, preferring to keep his professional and personal struggles separate. But as he finished his last consultation of the day, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Dr. Johnson?" His assistant, Lily, peeked in. "The chief of surgery wants to see you. He says it's urgent." Thomas sighed, already guessing what it was about. "Tell him I'll be right there." Across town at the police station, Officer Miller sat in Captain Reynolds' office, his posture stiff. The captain, a stern woman with 25 years on the force, motioned for him to close the door. She turned her computer screen toward him, her expression unreadable. "Sit down, Miller." He obeyed, his stomach twisting as he recognized the video on the screen, his interaction with Thomas at the park. The onlookers' murmurs, the way Thomas hesitated before handing over his ID, the growing tension in the crowd. Watching it from this angle, he realized something. His actions looked worse than he remembered. "It was a routine check, Captain," Miller said, trying to keep his voice even. "We've had reports of drug activity in that park." Captain Reynolds paused the video, her expression sharp. "Drug activity? And what made you suspect this particular man?" Miller hesitated. He was acting suspicious, watching the playground, checking his watch. "He was eating lunch, Miller." Reynolds tapped her desk impatiently. "And according to his statement, he was watching the ducks on the pond." She leaned back, folding her arms. "Do you know who Thomas Johnson is?" "Some doctor," Miller replied with a shrug. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Not just some doctor. Dr. Thomas Johnson is the head of cardiology at Franklin Medical Center. He pioneered a technique for valve replacement that has saved hundreds of lives." She paused, letting the words sink in. 6 months ago, he performed emergency surgery on Commissioner Walsh's wife when she had a heart attack. Miller's face paled. I didn't know." Clearly, Reynolds said, unimpressed. "The commissioner called me personally about this. The video has over 100,000 views now. People are calling for your badge." Miller swallowed hard. Back at Franklin Medical Center, Thomas sat across from Dr. Alan Peterson, the chief of surgery and his longtime friend. Alan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I saw the video, Thomas." His voice was gentle. "Are you okay?" Thomas looked down at his hands. "I'm fine." Alan shook his head. "That's what concerns me. The fact that this happens to you at all is unacceptable. The fact that it happens repeatedly." He gestured toward his tablet, where news articles featuring Thomas's face dominated the headlines. Statements from civil rights organizations, interviews with witnesses from the park, a growing outcry for police accountability. "This isn't just about you anymore," Alan said. "You've become a symbol of something much larger." That night, at home, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Lisa, after putting their 2 children to bed. She held his hand tightly as the news played on the television. The police department has placed Officer Richard Miller on administrative leave pending an investigation, the news anchor announced. Commissioner Walsh has issued a statement condemning the officer's actions and has personally reached out to Dr. Johnson to apologize. Lisa turned to Thomas. "Have you heard from him?" Thomas nodded. "He left a message. Wants to meet tomorrow." Lisa studied his face. "What are you going to do?" Thomas stared at his reflection in the dark window. "I don't know yet." He sighed. "Part of me wants to let it go, to just move on like I always have. But another part wants to fight," Lisa finished for him. "You should, not just for yourself, for others, for our children." Just then, Thomas's phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through. "Dr. Johnson? This is Rachel from the park. I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you should know." Thomas sat up straighter. "What is it?" Rachel's voice held a note of urgency. "Officer Miller came to my house today. He wanted to talk to me about what happened." Thomas's pulse quickened. "What did he say?" "He asked if I would meet with both of you. He said he wants to apologize. In person." After hanging up, Thomas told Lisa about the call. She frowned. "Do you think he's sincere?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out." Across town, Officer Miller sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through comments on the viral video. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "Saw you on the news. Mom's upset. Call her." Miller set the phone down without responding. For the first time, he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his actions and the reckoning that lay ahead. Thomas arrived at the community center where Rachel had arranged for him to meet Officer Miller. The building was quiet, with only a few elderly people playing cards in the main hall. Thomas found a small conference room at the end of the corridor, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Officer Miller sat alone at the table. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a plain gray shirt and jeans, looking noticeably different without his badge and gun. When he saw Thomas, he stood up awkwardly. "Dr. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Thomas hesitated before shaking Miller's hand. "I'm here to listen to what you have to say." They sat across from each other, an uncomfortable silence filling the room until Rachel arrived. She placed 2 cups of coffee on the table and took a seat at the end, acting as an informal mediator. "Officer Miller," she said, "you wanted this meeting." Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. "What happened in the park? I made assumptions." "Wrong assumptions," he admitted. He looked up at Thomas. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've developed habits, ways of seeing things, people. I thought I was just doing my job." Thomas's expression remained neutral. "Your job is to protect people," he said quietly. "Did I look like someone people needed protection from?" Miller didn't answer directly. "The department has mandatory training on bias," he continued. "But it's just something we sit through. Yesterday, after everything blew up, I went back and watched that video a dozen times. I saw myself through everyone else's eyes." He paused, taking a breath. "I have a nephew about your son's age," Miller admitted. "Last night, I thought about how I'd feel if someone treated him the way I treated you, just because of how he looks. I wouldn't stand for it." Thomas leaned forward. "This isn't just about you and me. This happens every day to people who don't have medical degrees, who don't know the police commissioner, who don't get viral videos." "What about them?" Miller nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I'm not fighting the suspension. I deserve it. But I also want to do more than just disappear for a few weeks and come back the same." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" Miller took a deep breath. "I want to change things from the inside." Thomas frowned. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I've talked to Captain Reynolds about developing a new training program," Miller said. "One that officers actually take seriously. And I'd like your help, Dr. Johnson." Thomas was taken aback. "My help?" Miller nodded. "Your perspective, your experiences. If officers could hear directly from people like you, respected professionals who have been profiled, maybe it would cut through in a way that standard training doesn't." Thomas didn't respond immediately. The proposition was unexpected. He thought about all the times he'd been followed in stores, pulled over for no reason, questioned in places where he had every right to be. "I need to think about it," he finally said. Rachel smiled encouragingly. "That's fair." As they stood to leave, a reporter spotted them through the window. Camera flashes began to light up the room from outside. "A surprise meeting." As the media swarmed, Rachel whispered, "There's a back exit." She led Thomas and Miller down a service hallway, slipping out through the kitchen to avoid the crowd. In the back parking lot, a familiar figure was waiting: Police Commissioner Walsh. He leaned against his car, arms crossed. "Dr. Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "I thought you might need a ride out of here." Thomas glanced at Miller, who looked just as surprised as he was. "Sir," Miller began, but Walsh cut him off. "We'll talk later, Miller. Right now, I'd like a word with Dr. Johnson." Rachel touched Thomas's arm. "I'll call you later." Thomas hesitated before getting into the commissioner's car. They drove in silence for several blocks. Finally, Walsh spoke. "My wife asks about you every time I come home with chest pain from these stressful days," he said. "She says, 'Have Dr. Johnson check you out. He's the only one I trust.'" Thomas nodded, remembering Mrs. Walsh's difficult surgery. "She's a fighter," Walsh said, "like you." He glanced at Thomas. Most people would have filed a formal complaint by now. Some would be calling for Miller's job, or threatening a lawsuit. "That's not my style," Thomas replied. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Walsh pulled into a small cafe parking lot and turned off the engine. "That's why I'm here." Thomas turned to him, skeptical. "Why now? This can't be the first incident of its kind in your department." Walsh sighed. "It's not, but it's the first one involving someone who saved my wife's life." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "So it took a personal connection for you to see clearly?" Walsh didn't deny it. "Sometimes that's what it takes." They entered the cafe, where Walsh outlined his proposal. "Miller's idea for a training program, I want to support it. Make it official, with funding, real teeth." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And in return?" "Nothing," Walsh said. "I want to fix this. It's long overdue." Thomas stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "One officer changing doesn't fix a broken system." Walsh nodded. "No, but it's a start." They shook hands. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "You're trending again. This time with Miller and the commissioner." "What's happening?" The story was growing beyond what any of them had anticipated. The next evening, a family conversation. Thomas sat in the living room with Lisa and their 2 children, watching news coverage of the developing story. Their 12-year-old son, Anthony, sat cross-legged on the floor, while 9-year-old Zoe leaned against her mother on the couch. "Dad, they're talking about you again," Anthony said, pointing at the screen. Thomas's hospital photo appeared alongside images from the park incident. A reporter stood outside police headquarters. "Sources tell us that Dr. Johnson met with both Officer Miller and Commissioner Walsh yesterday to discuss potential reforms in police training. This comes amid growing calls for accountability following the racially charged incident captured on video earlier this week." Zoe looked up at her father. "Did you really meet with the police officer who was mean to you?" Thomas nodded. "I did." "Why?" she asked, frowning. "He shouldn't have treated you that way." Thomas exchanged glances with Lisa before answering carefully. "Sometimes people make mistakes because they haven't learned better. And sometimes, if they're truly sorry, we can help them learn." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Lisa answered it to find Rachel standing on the porch, a folder in her hand. "I'm sorry to intrude on your family time," she said when Thomas joined them at the door. "But I thought you should see this before tomorrow's meeting." Thomas invited her in and examined the documents inside the folder. It contained statistics on police stops in the city, broken down by race and neighborhood. Alongside the data were personal accounts from community members who had experienced similar treatment to what Thomas had faced in the park. He looked up. "Where did you get all this?" "I work for the Community Justice Project," Rachel explained. "That's why I was at the park that day. We've been gathering data on incidents, just like yours, for the past 3 years." Thomas studied her with new understanding. "So when you stepped in, it wasn't just a neighbor helping a neighbor," Rachel confirmed. "Though that was part of it. We've been trying to get the police department's attention for years. Your case finally opened a door." Anthony wandered over, curious about their visitor. Rachel smiled at him. Your dad is helping make some important changes. Late that night, a decision is made after the children were in bed. Thomas and Lisa sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the material Rachel had brought. Lisa flipped through the reports, shaking her head. "These numbers are worse than I thought," she said quietly. "And these stories," Thomas nodded grimly. "All these people experienced what I did or worse, but they didn't have a medical degree or connections to make people listen." Lisa squeezed his hand. "But now they have you. You can make people listen." Thomas was silent for a moment. "If I do this, if I work with the department on their training program, some people will say I'm selling out. That I'm helping them whitewash the problem." Lisa met his gaze. "And others will say you're making real change from the inside." Thomas exhaled. "It's not about pleasing people." "No," Lisa agreed. "It's about doing what's right." They talked late into the night. By the time they went to bed, Thomas had made his decision. Tomorrow's meeting with the police department would be different than what Commissioner Walsh was expecting. He had his own plan now, one that would ensure real accountability. The next morning, police headquarters, the conference room was packed. Commissioner Walsh sat at the head of the table, flanked by Captain Reynolds and other high-ranking officers. Officer Miller sat quietly in a corner, looking uncomfortable in his formal uniform. Representatives from the mayor's office occupied one side of the table, while members of the Community Justice Project sat opposite them. Thomas entered last, carrying his laptop and Rachel's folder. The room fell silent as he took his place at the table. Walsh began the meeting. "As you all know, we're here to discuss a new training initiative following the unfortunate incident involving Dr. Johnson and Officer Miller." Thomas listened as Walsh outlined a proposal for sensitivity training, mandatory lectures and workshops for all officers. When Walsh finished, he turned to Thomas with a smile. "Dr. Johnson has generously agreed to participate in this program, sharing his personal experience to help our officers understand the impact of their actions." All eyes turned to Thomas. He opened his laptop and connected it to the projector. "Before I agree to anything," he said calmly, "I'd like to share something with you." The screen filled with a map of the city covered in red dots, clustered in specific neighborhoods. Each of these dots represents a complaint filed against your department for racial profiling over the past 5 years, Thomas explained. As you can see, they're concentrated in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. The room grew tense. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Thomas clicked to the next slide, a series of statistics showing how few complaints resulted in disciplinary action. Only 3% of these complaints led to any consequence for the officers involved, he continued. That's not a training issue. That's a culture issue. Walsh's smile faded. Dr. Johnson, we invited you here to collaborate, not to lecture us on how to run our department. Thomas met his gaze evenly. And I came here to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. He laid out his counter-proposal. An independent civilian review board with real authority, body cameras with strict activation protocols, regular public reports on all stops and arrests, broken down by race and neighborhood. He acknowledged Miller's mistake, but emphasized that the system allowed it to happen and encouraged it to happen. There was a long silence. Finally, a representative from the mayor's office spoke up. These are reasonable requests, Commissioner, and they align with reforms other cities have implemented successfully. Captain Reynolds leaned forward. Change is hard, but necessary. I support Dr. Johnson's proposals. All eyes turned to Walsh. His face was red from frustration. He was known for protecting his department, but he was also a skilled politician who knew when the tide was turning. Let's take a short break, Walsh said. Then we'll discuss the details of these additional measures. As people filed out of the room, Miller approached Thomas. His voice was quiet but sincere. Thank you, he said, for pushing for real change, not just window dressing. Thomas nodded, knowing the real work was just beginning. 2 weeks later, a public announcement 2 weeks after the meeting at police headquarters, Thomas found himself standing on a small stage in Washington Park, the very place where the incident had occurred. A crowd had gathered, community members, police officers, local officials, and reporters, all waiting for the announcement. In the front row, Lisa sat with their children, Anthony and Zoe. Next to them were Rachel and members of the Community Justice Project. Standing a few feet away, Commissioner Walsh and Captain Reynolds represented the police department. Even Officer Miller was there. still on administrative leave, but present for the event. Thomas stepped up to the microphone. "This is where it all started," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "What happened to me here wasn't unique. It was just one example of something that happens every day in cities across the country." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "But today, I'm proud to announce that change is coming." The crowd listened intently as Thomas outlined the reforms that had been approved. The creation of an independent civilian review board with real investigative authority, mandatory body cameras for all officers with clear guidelines for when they must be activated, quarterly public reports on police stops and arrests, broken down by race and neighborhood. Applause rippled through the crowd. Thomas waited for it to subside before continuing. "These changes won't fix everything overnight, but they are a step in the right direction." Commissioner Walsh stepped up next, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "These reforms require us to re-examine how we've been doing things," he admitted. "But they are necessary if we want to build trust with the communities we serve." As the formal speeches ended, people mingled on the grass, talking about what had just been announced. A local news crew interviewed Rachel about the Community Justice Project's role in bringing about the reforms. "We've been gathering data and stories for years," she explained. "It took Dr. Johnson's case to finally break through, but this victory belongs to everyone who spoke up and refused to be silenced." Nearby, Anthony cautiously approached Officer Miller. "Are you the one who stopped my dad?" he asked. Miller nodded, kneeling down to meet Anthony's eye level. "I am," he said. Anthony hesitated. "My dad says everyone makes mistakes." Miller nodded, his expression somber. "He's right. What matters is learning from them." The young boy studied him for a moment, then nodded before running back to his family. A mother's perspective across the park. Thomas was deep in conversation with Captain Reynolds about the implementation details of the new policies when Lisa approached with a woman he didn't recognize. "Thomas, this is Officer Miller's mother," Lisa said. "She wanted to meet you." The older woman had Miller's same blue eyes, now brimming with tears. "I raised my son better than what he did that day," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm proud of how he's handled it since, and I'm grateful to you for giving him a chance to make it right." Thomas shook her hand warmly. "This was never about punishing your son," he said. "It was about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through what I did." As the sun began to set, Thomas looked around at the unlikely coalition that had formed community activists, police officers, city officials, and ordinary citizens. The work ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he felt hopeful that real change was possible. What had started as a moment of injustice was transforming into a movement for justice. 6 months later, a new beginning. 6 months had passed since the reforms were announced in Washington Park. On a crisp fall morning, Thomas arrived at the police academy to deliver his first official training session to a new class of recruits. As he entered the classroom, the room fell silent. 24 young faces watched him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. At the back of the room, Officer Miller, recently reinstated, stood alongside Captain Reynolds. Miller had been instrumental in developing the new training curriculum, drawing on his own experience to illustrate how unconscious bias could affect split-second decisions. Thomas took a deep breath and began his lecture. "Good morning. My name is Dr. Thomas Johnson. Some of you may recognize me from the news." A few recruits nodded. His story had become well known throughout the city. "I'm here today not as a victim and not as an activist," he continued, "but as someone who believes you have the power to shape what policing looks like in our community." He paused, scanning the room. What happened to me in Washington Park wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a system that allowed, maybe even encouraged, those decisions to be made. But systems can change. Miller stepped forward. "What happened that day in the park was my failure," he told the recruits. "But the system failed, too. We didn't have the right training, the right metrics, or the right accountability. That's changing now. And you are part of that change." 1 year later, a full-circle moment, 1 year to the day after the incident in Washington Park, Thomas returned to the same bench where Officer Miller had confronted him. The cherry trees were in bloom again. Children played on the swings just as they had that day. Thomas unwrapped his sandwich and watched the ducks glide across the pond. A familiar voice spoke. Mind if I join you? Thomas looked up to see Officer Miller, dressed in casual clothes, standing nearby. Please, Thomas said, gesturing to the space beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the park activity. After a few moments, Miller spoke. The department released the annual report yesterday, he said. Complaints are down 30%. Stops and searches have decreased by almost half, but arrest rates for serious crimes haven't changed. Thomas nodded. Rachel showed me the numbers. It's progress, Miller exhaled. It's because of you, he admitted. If you had just filed a complaint or sued the department, I'd probably be working security somewhere and nothing would have changed. Thomas shook his head. It wasn't just me. Rachel and her team had been pushing for years. The community was ready, and you were willing to change. Not everyone would have been. A young officer walked by on patrol, nodding respectfully to both men. She wore a body camera prominently on her uniform. Miller watched her pass. You know, he said, my sister's son is talking about becoming a police officer now. Before all this, I wouldn't have encouraged him. I was becoming too cynical about the job. But now, I think maybe he could be part of something better. Thomas smiled. Anthony asked me last week if he could be both a doctor and work on police reform someday. Miller raised an eyebrow. And what did you tell him? I told him he could do anything that matters to him. They finished their lunches as the afternoon sun warmed the park. As they stood to leave, a woman walking her dog recognized them. Aren't you the doctor and the officer from the news? She smiled. My brother's on the force in Chicago. He said they're looking at implementing the same changes you made here. Thomas and Miller exchanged a glance. 1 year ago, they never would have imagined this moment. Sometimes, Thomas said, the worst moments can lead to the best changes if we're willing to do the hard work. And as they left the park, they walked side by side, no longer adversaries. Not quite friends, but partners in something greater.